My name is Ellen Vanderhoven. I'm a research associate at the University of Glasgow and the lead author of the paper Realising the Human Development Promise in Dual Vet, which was recently published in Compare. I've been invited by my colleagues at URFSA, who also contributed to this paper, to respond to a couple of questions. So here we go. So when we talk about education for development, broadly speaking, it's generally accepted that the outcomes we should be seeking relate to more than just economic growth and the associated metrics. There's an agreement that we should be looking to enhance people's agency, offer them choice, possibility about the direction of their lives, and address systemic inequalities that stymie those possibilities for many people. And yet, when we look at vocational education, dual vet being one important example, the conversation very often centres on competitiveness, productivity, employment, which all ultimately relate to this goal of increased growth. And where social goals are discussed, be that social inclusion, social cohesion, generating more dignified employment, these very often come back to the economic questions, and they're not necessarily seen as ends in their own right. So one reason to look at DVET and the associated literature from a human development lens is because we have this rhetorical agreement that this might be a better way of understanding education, but that holistic perspective or approach is not necessarily carried through into policy making, particularly when you're talking about vocational education like DVET. The other reason is because when you view DVET through such a narrow economistic lens, it encourages practices which are not necessarily effective or impactful. It can strip away understanding the very complex social and institutional context that's at the heart of DVET in its most well-known German-speaking context in Europe. It assumes that the same economic processes occur and can be influenced in the same ways across a great variety of different contexts, which encourages not the most contextually sensitive policymaking. It also sidelines the question of equity and inequality and frames young people as largely relevant to the policy process. So ultimately, the goal of applying such a lens is to encourage better DVET policy and practice. That's by preventing some of the evident shortcomings that come from the current narrow lens, but also by highlighting the many other contributions that DVET can make, which are not necessarily recognised when we look at the policy in this way. Because importantly, young people very often have very positive things to say about their participation, but they also emphasise that this can be easily undermined by exploitative and low quality training experiences and social inequalities of different kinds. So our main takeaways would be that although there's this talk of alignment between human development principles and dual vet policy and practice, we would argue that this remains more of a kind of theoretical possibility than an actual reality. So while we would acknowledge that there are plenty of tensions and challenges inherent in aligning the two, we'd like to see an expanded vision of what DVET can achieve and more attention paid to the facets of DVET's functioning that human development prioritises. So that means quality learning experiences, attention to inequality, offering young people more agency over their trajectories, thinking about how DVET functions within the wider policy ecosystem, and generating dignified work and career opportunities. So part of supporting that shift in policy and practice will mean a shift in research focus too. So first of all, there's a need for more research on DVET in low and middle income country contexts, especially research that doesn't simply evaluate those programs in contrast to donor models and therefore rely on kind of donor-led remedies. We'd also encourage more research on DVET that's very attentive to contextual conditions, that asks evaluative questions that go beyond economic metrics, that treats young people as primary stakeholders, and that interrogates the relationship between DVET and social inequalities of different kinds. So we kind of have four main takeaways for dual vet practice. The first being that it will be helpful to reposition DVET as an educational intervention, not just an economic one. So refocusing attention on its pedagogical advantages might challenge that quite narrow vision which is so prevalent and encourage a more holistic approach to DVET policymaking. Secondly, it's clear that top-down DVET reforms are unlikely to be effective in any of the metrics, in fact. Instead, local policy ownership and contextual relevance are going to be crucial to ensuring that DVET can achieve the positive outcomes that we'd all like to see, but also not produce unintended spillover effects in other areas of the education system. The third point is that equity should be a core concern in designing and implementing DVET programs. So that relates not just to access to getting young people in, but also to their training experiences and the outcomes and pathways they're able to achieve once they graduate. Fourthly and finally, young people are an invaluable source of information about how DVET programs are functioning. So they should be involved in policy design and evaluation processes, and their own interests and life projects should be of systemic importance to how DVET programs operate. And when it comes to research on education and VET, we would say that the kinds of debates that relate to human development that are occurring in broader education research are just as relevant to vocational education and to DVET. Seeing VET as somehow exempt from those concerns because of its occupational orientation really leads down a very impoverished path. So we would say equally that it would only strengthen our research and policy knowledge of education as a whole to ensure that DVET and VET more broadly are well integrated into those efforts and those debates.